Hello fellow YouTubers, welcome to my channel. Today in this video I'm going to be talking about coppicing as a forest management method, and in particular I'm going to be talking about coppicing hazel trees. So this is a hazel here. You can see it's got multiple stems. There's a lot of them around this section of the woodland, and they would have all have been coppiced at some point in the past, and that's what causes them to produce these multi-stemmed structures. So coppicing is quite an old management tool, been around for a long time, at least 1,000 years. In medieval time they used to use it in conjunction with the sheep. There was a big sheep and wool industry in Britain, and the products from the hazel coppice they would use to make things like fences, hurdles, etc. And they used to use it for managing their sheep flock. But are some sources where people think it actually goes back even further than that, probably 2,000, possibly even 3,000 years. They found evidence of trackways in marshes, etc., where they would have cut down things like hazel and used the products to create structures for their survival. It's a lovely crisp winter's morning today, and winter is generally a really good time for coppicing, and there's a few reasons for that. Firstly, there's a lot less foliage, so you're able to access the stems a lot more easily. There's less disruption to wildlife because they aren't nesting in the trees, using it as a habitat or a shelter. And another key reason is the way to think about a tree, and particularly the trees that you coppice, they're actually a tale of two halves. So what you see above ground is actually mirrored underneath the ground as well. So there's a really strong big root structure under the ground, which is often the same size or the equivalent biomass of what you see above ground. So what the trees do is in the winter they actually pull a lot of the sugars out of the main tree, and the sap is actually the sugars are pulled down into the roots, and they use it as storage, so it actually becomes fairly dormant over the winter. And then in the spring they flush it back, the sap flushes back up, so sugars rise up through the stems, and by coppicing in the winter, a lot of that sugar has been pulled down into the rootstock, and because there's less sugar in the actual wood, when you take the product that you're going to use for poles or logs, they don't decay as quickly because there's less tasty sugars in the wood for grubs and fungus, etc. So there's a few reasons why winter is a really good time for coppicing, and that's a few of them. So hazel is actually one of the best trees to coppice. There's a long tradition of coppicing hazel, and they are really good at regenerating from their roots. And the way they work is that there's a number of buds all along the stem, all the way up. But most of these trees, they actually have a dominant bud at the top, which is where they grow from. So a lot of these smaller buds on the sides actually stay dormant through the year. But when it gets cut, the tree responds by reinvigorating that bud, and those are the new growth, so the new poles shoot from those buds, and they all spring up from that bark. So one of the important things is to make sure when you cut the trunks down, you've got enough space where you can at least clear the moss and see some of those little buds so that they can flush in the spring. And what will happen is that rootstock will just sense that all their trunks have gone. They want to get stems and leaves up into the air to get photosynthesize, and so they will really push in a lot of energy into those stems, and they will grow from those buds. So coppicing tools are fairly straightforward. If there's a large area to be coppiced, a lot of people use chainsaws, and I have used a chainsaw in the past, and I would typically use a chainsaw. It's quite a nice peaceful day. The one problem with the chainsaw, makes a lot of noise. But if you do want to do big areas of coppice, the chainsaw is fairly compulsory these days. But the tools I'm going to be using today, simple bow saw, and that's really what I'm going to do the bulk of the cutting of the trunks. You can see they're not very big, so they should be easily taken down with a bow saw. And then to actually produce the product you want to use, which is the wood, the trunks, you can use something like a bill hook or an axe. In this case it's my Rinaldi axe, which you've seen in some of my other videos. And it's actually, I believe it's a pruning axe, so it should be quite good at just limbing the branches quite quickly. So those are the main tools I'm going to be using. If you look a bit closer, that's a fairly small stool, and you can see the multiple stems. If you look at this one, there's a very old stem there, and then a number of smaller ones. So at some point in time, this was coppiced, and that was the original trunk, and a number of other smaller shoots have actually come out from that original stump. Now, it's actually decaying and dead, this one, so it is quite a common strategy for trees to employ. They shoot again, particularly Hazel are very good at it. They will shoot from their rootstock because those roots there underneath are still functioning well. Now, one of the advantages of coppicing, it is a man-made management tool, so there's an argument as to why you would do it. You know, why don't you let nature take its course? Well, a lot of the woodland left in Britain is all heavily managed, and there's not a lot left really of any kind of wild wood. So it's a good way of rejuvenating a tree, because that rootstock will then stay vibrant and keep pumping vitality into the stems. The knock-on effect of all of that is actually that the biodiversity of the woodland, as you can see, this is quite overstood, which means it's overgrown, and it's shading all the ground. So what's happening, you're getting a lot of moss, but not much else. When you actually coppice and reduce the crown right down to the rootstock, you get flushes of flowers which support insects like a lot of woodland butterflies, small mammals, etc. So there's a number of those animals which have actually, and plants which have adapted to coppice management, and so it's a really useful thing to ensure that you can actually make a small area as biodiverse as possible. So although it's a human invented management tool, it has got a lot of benefits for encouraging biodiversity in the woodland. So in this case, with this one, we're going to take all of these stems out, and this one, and then the crown, the area that's covering the crown, will be reduced, allowing light down into the woodland floor. And in the spring, a lot of these shoots will flush out, and there'll be a big undergrowth will pop up as well. So dormant bulbs and other flowers will come up through the soil, and you should see an increase in insects and small mammals will come back into this area. So it actually is a way of taking a moribund woodland and making it a lot more vital and biodiverse. Okay, so I've finished cutting all the main stems down, as you can see. But it's important to do quite a neat job, and you also want it to be sloping, if possible, towards the outside of the stump, and that just helps to shed water. I've also cleared out a lot of the leaf litter from the center of the stump, and that's really to stop any rot and decay happening in the middle of the stump. So come spring, really these stems have got the best opportunity to flush out the new buds. So it's a nice clean finish, and hopefully it's in the best place it can be for the spring. I also noticed actually there's quite a few little hazel shells have been eaten by squirrels, and that's probably a reason why we never get any hazelnuts off these trees. The squirrels are all over the place. Unfortunately it's the grey squirrel, not the red, so a bit of a pest, and they pretty much eat all the hazels before we get any. Something to consider when you're handling the logs that you've taken down is, where possible, is to sort of lay them in the same direction. So when you were working your way through a woodland, you fell them all down in the same direction and work your way back. It just makes it a lot easier when you're going through, limbing them, taking the brush off, etc. If they're all very higgledy-piggledy, it's actually quite difficult to get in amongst them to deal with them. So where possible, you lay them out in the same line of orientation. So we finished processing all the material now. We'll cut everything up into various sizes. And if this was a well-managed coppice, on a sort of 15-year rotation maximum, we would have had nice straight poles which could have used for a variety of activities. The problem with this stuff is actually been growing well over 20 years since it was last coppice, so it's all a bit straggly, and the majority of this is actually really just fit for firewood and kindling. So the last thing we've done is we've used all this fine brush, which is the tops of the trunks, just to make a windrow, and that's a good way of just creating habitat for small mammals, but also for protecting regrowth of delicate flowers and things. So it's good practice, and never be tempted to burn that because it's really valuable as a habitat.